It hasn't been funded by the alcohol industry, yet it profoundly challenges the views set out by those who advise governments, including the British government, on this issue. Just give you a snapshot of what we found. Only a handful of the 30 econometric studies of alcohol advertising and consumption and drinking initiation done over the last 20 years support the claim that alcohol advertising leads to drinking initiation or increases total consumption. Virtually all of the studies of alcohol advertising exposure and recall fail to meet the minimal standards of science in that they are unable to warrant the integrity of their measurements. Further, their results, even those few that are statistically significant, demonstrate only weak associations and fail to show any causal connection between advertising and consumption, drinking initiation, and alcohol-related harm. There have been 17 cross-sectional, longitudinal studies of the effects of advertising restrictions and bans. Only 3 find a significant effect on either initiation and consumption. Further, the evidence from jurisdictions that have removed bans shows that consumption hasn't increased when advertising has resumed. Absent the wrong sort of funding, I'll leave it to the public health establishment to tell us where we've gone so obviously horribly wrong. Now, in addition to a dissection of the health paternalism mantra underlying the bully state, let me suggest to you that what's needed is a robust articulation of the case for individual autonomy. Such a case would flesh out the following points. Individual autonomy is the core value of a democratic society. There's an inherent trade-off between individual autonomy and public health under health paternalism. And the abandonment of individual autonomy in health policy poses a threat to our other freedoms as well. To make matters worse and more difficult to fix, the language of denormalization has now entered the debate over alcohol policy. It's all integral to government's desire to create what is called a culture of responsible drinking. Implicit in the alcohol denormalization campaign's message is the argument that alcohol advertising indirectly encourages underage drinking. Government advisors continue to propose new measures to reduce excessive drinking, especially among young people. It was a year ago that Professor Salim Donaldson, who's about to retire as the long-standing Chief Medical Officer of the United Kingdom, urged the government to introduce minimum pricing for alcohol to combat what Salim and others term passive drinking. That is, the damage caused by drunk drivers, domestic violence, etc. They think that that a higher price will make alcohol unobtainable by young people. It's been noted by others that those with a basic grasp of both economics and human nature might appreciate that based on this model, drug abusers are deterred successfully by the high price of heroin, cocaine, etc. But in an interview in yesterday's Sunday Telegraph, an undeterred Salim says the UK government's failure to clamp down on cheap alcohol is the public health failure of the last decade. Another prescription would see restricted access to alcohol, despite the fact that only a tiny percentage of the British population has a drinking problem, while the vast majority enjoys a drink safely, regularly, and responsibly. Revealingly, taxpayer-funded adverts focus less on the health effects of excessive drinking and more on how being drunk will offend the opposite sex. The government's message is those who get drunk, even occasionally, should be shunned and they should be marginalized. For example, serious denormalization campaigners argue that supermarkets should have separate checkout registers for people purchasing alcohol along with other shopping. And I suggest to you that one need not be an American-style libertarian or a European-style classical liberal to appreciate the stewardship ethics threat to a democratic society. Rather than the product of an ideological agenda, a plea for personal choice as the foundational value of public health is in stark contrast a plea for both common sense and morality in policy making. As bully staters don't want anyone to drink alcohol, smoke cigarettes, gamble, or gain weight, they're going to ratchet up their campaign to shame and coerce those who rejoice in the individual's right to pursue pleasure. Under the bully state, the real bully is nanny, the policy nurse, who dispenses regulatory cures for all manner of alleged social ills, from drinking to smoking to eating to gambling to simply having fun. Now, we don't need to conjure, out of thin air the appropriate popular response to health paternalism. It's been staring us in the face for at least 5 centuries. Some of you may recall Martin Luther. He had a recommendation on this very issue. He said, and I quote, "If the devil should say, 'Do not drink,' you should reply to him, 'Because you forbid it, I shall drink, and what is more, I shall drink a generous amount.' Thus, one must always do the opposite of that which Satan prohibits. What do you think is my reason for drinking wine, if it is not to torment and vex the devil, who made up his mind to torment and vex me?" Now, today, psychologists call such a rebellious, unintended response reactance. The rest of us know it simply as human nature and common sense. I'm reasonably confident, however, that there'll be dramatic growth in people's unwillingness to be bullied out of and into particular habits. This will create an opportunity, I hope, for the first politician who stands in front of the bully state's regulatory march yelling, "Stop." By the end of the decade, it's possible, just possible, that most Westerners will be actively rebelling against their respective department of the domestic bully. Appropriately harnessed, such a popular groundswell may demand a scaled-down state, at least in the public health arena. This would ensure a focus on the legitimate role of government in healthcare policy, providing credible information, refraining from propaganda and persuasion, and funding evidence-based care. But a decade is a long time to wait. It's a very long time to hear ad nausea how alcohol and other evils are responsible for much of what's wrong with today's society. We need to redouble our efforts to educate people that drunkenness doesn't create vice. It merely brings it into view. As P.J. O'Rourke says, no drug, not even alcohol, causes the fundamental ills of society. If we're looking for the source of our troubles, we shouldn't test people for drugs. We should test them for stupidity, ignorance, greed, and most importantly, love of power. But what we should do and what we will do are 2 very different things. So the next few years will test our patience, they'll test our resolve, and in the case of some of us, they'll test our faith. Let me end then with a piece of advice, at least for those of you who fall into that last category. In the coming struggles, do what I do. I prefer to think that God is not dead. He's just drunk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. A lot of issues we're going to talk about there, and we will come back to them after the coffee break.